The innocent words that changed everything. The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains of Julia Carter's bedroom, casting a warm glow on the cream-colored walls. She had barely slept. Work had kept her up late, and her mind refused to shut down even when she finally collapsed onto the bed. Running on just a few hours of rest, she groggily pulled herself out of bed and stumbled toward the kitchen, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted her. Her daughter, Mia, sat at the small breakfast table, swinging her legs absent-mindedly while nibbling on a piece of toast. The 10-year-old had her hair tied up in a messy ponytail, her school uniform slightly wrinkled. Julia made a mental note to iron it better next time. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee and taking a much-needed sip. Mia smiled up at her. "Morning, Mom. You're up late again. Are you okay?" Julia forced a smile. "I'm fine, baby. Just had a lot of work to finish." Mia nodded, though she looked unconvinced. Julia had been pulling long hours lately, trying to balance work and single motherhood. It had been just the two of them ever since her ex-husband, Darren, walked out of their lives 5 years ago. Not that she ever expected him to stay. Darren wasn't the type to stick around when things got tough. "I'm excited for today," Mia chirped, her brown eyes lighting up. "Mr. Grayson said we might do something special if we do well on our quiz." Julia smiled, though a twinge of guilt gnawed at her. She had meant to read the school's latest updates, but between work and exhaustion, she hadn't had time. "That's great. What kind of special thing?" Mia shrugged, chewing on her toast. "Maybe a fun activity or a trip. Last time, we got to go to the museum." Julia frowned slightly. "Museum? When was that?" "Last week," Mia answered enthusiastically. "It was super cool. Mr. Grayson even let me and Emma go to Daddy's house for lunch after." Julia almost dropped her coffee mug. The world around her seemed to slow down. Her grip tightened around the handle, and she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "Daddy's house," she repeated carefully. Mia nodded, oblivious to the growing alarm in her mother's voice. "Yeah, Mr. Grayson's house. We all call him Daddy sometimes. He's super nice." Julia's breath hitched. Every nerve in her body went on high alert. "Wait, sweetheart, who calls him that?" "The kids in class," Maya said, her tone casual, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "It's just a nickname. He says it makes him feel special." A cold feeling settled in Julia's stomach. Something wasn't right. Trying to keep calm, she asked, "And what happened at his house?" Mia hesitated for a second. "We had lunch. His wife made pasta. He has a big house, Mom. It's way nicer than ours." Julia inhaled sharply. Mr. Grayson had a wife. That was at least somewhat reassuring. But why hadn't she heard about this before? More importantly, why would a teacher take students to his home without notifying parents? Forcing a calm expression, she leaned down, brushing a stray hair from Mia's forehead. "Sweetheart, next time something like this happens, you have to tell me, okay? Even if Granny signs a paper, I need to know everything you're doing." Mia looked at her with confusion. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, baby," Julia said softly. "I just want to make sure you're always safe." She glanced at the clock. They were running late. "We need to get going," Julia said, forcing a smile. "Finish up and grab your bag." Mia shrugged, finishing her toast and hopping off the chair. She skipped toward the door, humming to herself, completely unaware of the storm brewing in her mother's mind. Julia's hands trembled slightly as she grabbed her keys. This wasn't just a casual oversight. This was something bigger, something she needed to get to the bottom of. As they walked out the door and into the crisp morning air, Julia knew one thing for certain. She was going to have a serious conversation with Mr. Grayson. And she had a sinking feeling she wouldn't like what she found. A mother's instinct. The drive to school was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, Maya would be chattering about her favorite cartoons, the newest game she wanted, or some funny thing a classmate had done the day before. But today, Julia was too lost in her thoughts to ask questions, and Mia, sensing her mother's tension, stayed silent. The words "Daddy's house" replayed in Julia's mind like a broken record. Every part of her screamed that something was wrong, but she forced herself to stay calm for Mia's sake. Silverwood Academy was just a 10-minute drive away, but it felt like an eternity before Julia finally pulled into the parking lot. The school looked the same as always, clean, well-maintained, with children rushing in through the front gates, excitedly greeting their friends. The familiarity should have been reassuring, but today it wasn't. Today it felt off. Julia watched the other parents as they dropped off their kids, chatting casually amongst themselves, oblivious to the storm raging inside her mind. Did any of them know about this? Had other children been to Daddy's house, or was it just Mia? As she parked the car and turned off the engine, she glanced at Mia, who was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her small face bright with anticipation for the day ahead. Julia took a deep breath, pushing aside her worry for the moment. She needed to handle this carefully. "Mia, honey," she said as gently as she could, "I want you to do something for me today, okay? I want you to pay close attention to Mr. Grayson and tell me everything he says and does when you get home. Even little things, okay?" Mia frowned. Why? Did he do something bad? Julia hesitated for only a second before shaking her head. "No, sweetheart. I just want to know more about your day. I feel like I've been so busy with work that I haven't been paying enough attention to your school stuff, and that's not fair to you." Mia seemed satisfied with that answer and gave her a reassuring smile. "Okay, Mommy. I'll tell you everything." Julia kissed her forehead and watched as Mia hopped out of the car, her backpack bouncing on her small shoulders as she ran toward the entrance. Julia wanted to follow her, to storm inside and demand answers from Mr. Grayson right then and there. But she knew better. If there was something going on, she needed to approach it the right way. She needed to gather information, ask the right questions, and not let emotions cloud her judgment. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she reached for her phone, her fingers tightening around it as she debated her next move. Should she call the principal? Confront the teacher directly? She decided against both. Not yet. First, she needed to gather some facts. And there was only one person who would know if something was off: her best friend, Rachel. Rachel had 2 kids in Silverwood Academy, both older than Mia, and she was the kind of mom who knew everything about the school, the teachers, and the gossip among the parents. If anyone had concerns about Mr. Grayson, she would know. Julia pressed the call button and waited as the line rang. "Hey, Jules." Rachel's cheerful voice answered after the second ring. "What's up? Everything okay?" Julia hesitated before speaking, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Hey, Rach. Yeah, everything's fine. I just wanted to ask if you know much about one of the teachers at Silverwood, Mr. Grayson." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Grayson? Yeah, I know him. He teaches 5th grade, right? I don't have much experience with him, but I've heard he's well liked by the kids. Why?" Julia gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Mia mentioned something weird today. She said she and some other kids went to his house after a museum trip. Have you ever heard of him doing that before?" Rachel was silent for a moment, and Julia's stomach clenched. "Wait, she went to his house?" Rachel asked, her voice dropping to a lower, more serious tone. "That's not normal. Teachers aren't supposed to take kids to their personal homes, even if it's for a school trip. That sounds like a major red flag." Julia's heart pounded. "That's what I thought. But she said another kid was with her. Emma, I think." "Emma Dawson," Rachel said immediately. "Her mom, Lisa, is in my book club. Want me to ask her?" "Yes, please," Julia said without hesitation. "And let me know if she says anything." "You got it," Rachel promised. "And Jules, trust your gut. If something doesn't feel right, it isn't right." Julia swallowed hard. Yeah, I know. They ended the call, and Julia pulled into her driveway, her mind spinning with possibilities. Rachel was right. Teachers weren't supposed to take kids to their homes, not without clear permission from every parent involved. If Lisa Dawson had also signed a permission slip, why hadn't she known about it? As she stepped inside her house, she barely noticed the soft aroma of lavender filling the air. Her mother-in-law, Evelyn, was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands. "Julia," Evelyn greeted her warmly. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon. Everything all right?" Julia hesitated before sitting down across from her. "Something's wrong, Evelyn," she admitted, rubbing her temples. "Something is seriously wrong." She recounted the conversation with Mia, watching as Evelyn's warm expression turned to one of deep concern. When she was finished, the older woman set down her tea and folded her hands together. "That is not normal," Evelyn said firmly. "A teacher taking students to his home like that, even with a wife, that is crossing a line." Julia nodded. "I don't know what to do. I don't want to accuse him of anything without proof, but I know something isn't right. I can feel it." Evelyn studied her carefully, then reached across the table and squeezed Julia's hand. "You don't need proof to trust your instincts, sweetheart. If something feels off, you investigate. That's what a good mother does." Julia took a deep breath. "I already asked Rachel to check with another parent. If her daughter was there too, then it means this wasn't just a one-time thing. And if that's the case..." She trailed off, not wanting to voice the horrifying possibilities racing through her mind. Evelyn nodded solemnly. "Then you need to go to the school, speak to the principal, and if they brush it off, you take it to the district. You don't stop until you have answers." Julia swallowed the lump in her throat. This was all happening too fast, but she couldn't ignore it. She had spent too much time lost in work, letting her daughter's daily life slip through her fingers. Not anymore. Her phone vibrated on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Rachel. She answered immediately. "Did you talk to Lisa?" Rachel's voice was hushed, but urgent. "Jules, you're not gonna like this. Lisa didn't sign any permission slip. She didn't even know Emma went to Mr. Grayson's house. She's freaking out." Julia felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something much, much worse. Unraveling the lie. Julia's fingers clenched around her phone as Rachel's words echoed in her ears. Lisa didn't sign any permission slip. She didn't even know Emma went to Mr. Grayson's house. She's freaking out. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she tried to steady herself. This wasn't just some innocent school trip. This wasn't a simple case of miscommunication. This was something far more sinister. "Julia, are you still there?" Rachel's voice sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. "I'm here," Julia managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did Lisa say exactly?" "She said Emma mentioned something about going to a teacher's house, but Lisa assumed it was some kind of school-related thing. She didn't think much of it at the time. But after I told her what Maya said, she started panicking." Rachel exhaled, and Julia could hear the tension in her friend's voice. "Jules, I don't think this is a coincidence. If neither of you signed permission slips, then how the hell did these kids get taken off school property without anyone noticing?" Julia's stomach churned. "That's what I'm going to find out. I can come with you if you want," Rachel offered. "Lisa, too. She's ready to storm the school herself." "No," Julia said firmly. "Not yet. If we all go in there angry, they'll just get defensive. I need to be smart about this. I need answers before I escalate it." "Okay, but promise me you won't let them brush this off." Julia tightened her grip on the phone. "I won't." Ending the call, she looked up to find Evelyn watching her carefully from across the kitchen table. The older woman's face was calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in her gaze. "Well?" Evelyn asked. Julia let out a slow breath. Emma's mother had no idea about the trip. She never gave permission. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. Then you need to go to the school. Now. Julia nodded, already grabbing her keys. Her mind was racing, but she forced herself to stay focused. Storming in with accusations would get her nowhere. She needed to handle this carefully. If there was any wrongdoing, she had to make sure it wasn't ignored or swept under the rug. She drove back to Silverwood Academy, her grip tight on the steering wheel. The school's parking lot was mostly empty now, save for a few scattered cars belonging to teachers and administrators. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and headed toward the front office. Inside, the school's secretary, Mrs. Coleman, looked up from her desk, offering Julia a polite but mildly surprised smile. "Mrs. Carter, I wasn't expecting to see you again today. Is everything all right?" Julia forced a smile, though every nerve in her body was on edge. "I just have a few questions about a recent school trip. Is Principal Harmon available?" Mrs. Coleman glanced at the office door before nodding. "I believe so. Let me check." She picked up the phone and pressed a button. "Principal Harmon, Mrs. Carter is here to see you." "Yes, I'll send her in." The door to the principal's office opened a few moments later, and Julia stepped inside. Principal Rebecca Harmon, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Mrs. Carter, please have a seat," Principal Harmon said, folding her hands on the desk. "What can I do for you?" Julia didn't sit. "I need to ask about the museum trip last week." The principal raised an eyebrow. "All right. What about it?" Julia inhaled deeply, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "Mia mentioned she and another student, Emma Dawson, were taken to Mr. Grayson's house after the trip. Is that standard practice? Do teachers often take students to their homes?" A flicker of surprise crossed Principal Harmon's face before she quickly masked it with her usual composed expression. "I wasn't aware of that." She leaned back slightly, choosing her words carefully. "I know Mr. Grayson took a small group of students on an enrichment activity. However, the details of what followed weren't reported to me directly. If he did take them to his home, that is not protocol." Julia's jaw tightened. "It's not just that, Principal Harmon. Neither I nor Emma's mother signed any permission slips for this trip. How is it possible that 2 children were taken off school property without parental consent?" The principal's eyes darkened slightly, and Julia could see the tension in her posture. "That shouldn't have happened. If what you're saying is true, then it is a serious breach of school policy." Julia didn't let up. "Did the school approve this trip? Did you personally sign off on it?" Principal Harmon hesitated. "I approved the general trip. It was part of our academic enrichment program. But as for the specifics, I left the details to the teachers handling the activity." Julia's chest tightened. "So you had no idea that Mr. Grayson was taking students to his private home?" "I did not." The principal's voice was firm now. "And if that is the case, I will be having a very serious discussion with Mr. Grayson." Julia took a step closer to the desk, her pulse pounding. "I want to speak with him. Right now." Principal Harmon glanced at the clock. "He should still be on campus. I'll have Mrs. Coleman call him in." Julia folded her arms, forcing herself to remain calm as the secretary made the call. The minutes stretched on painfully, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the door opened, and Mr. Grayson walked in. He looked exactly as he had that morning, calm, well-dressed, and every bit the picture of a dedicated teacher. But now, as Julia studied him, she noticed something else, something off. There was a slight flicker in his expression when he saw her, a brief moment of recognition, maybe even hesitation, before he quickly masked it with his usual friendly demeanor. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted her with a warm smile. "Is everything all right?" Julia didn't return the smile. "I have some questions for you, Mr. Grayson." He nodded, looking between her and the principal. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Julia's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to stay in control. Mia told me she and Emma Dawson went to your house after the museum trip. Is that true? For a brief second, something flashed in his eyes, something quick, barely noticeable. Then he smiled again. Ah, yes. That was a bit of an unusual situation. We ran into a small issue with lunch arrangements, and I thought it would be easiest to bring them to my house for a meal. My wife cooked, and it was just a quick visit. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. She already knew the truth. Your wife. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding. Yes, my wife. She enjoys cooking, and the kids seem to love the food. Julia took a slow, deliberate breath before delivering the final blow. Funny. The school has no record of you being married. For the first time, she saw real fear flicker in Mr. Grayson's expression. And in that moment, Julia knew she had caught him in a lie. The truth begins to unravel. For a brief, fleeting second, Mr. Grayson's mask slipped. It was barely noticeable, just a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. But Julia saw it, and in that moment, she knew. He was hiding something. She felt her pulse pounding in her ears as she waited for his response. Principal Harmon, now clearly aware that something was amiss, straightened in her chair, her sharp blue eyes locked onto the teacher in question. Mr. Grayson, the principal said, her voice measured but firm. You told Mrs. Carter that you took the students to your house because of a lunch issue. I was not informed of this. More importantly, Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Dawson never signed permission slips allowing their daughters to leave school property. Do you have an explanation for this? Mr. Grayson let out a small, controlled laugh, shaking his head as if the entire situation was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Of course, this is just a misunderstanding. I didn't realize the permission slips hadn't been signed. I thought the forms had been handled by the administration. And as for my wife, well, I don't talk about my personal life at work much. I suppose it never came up. Julia clenched her fists. He was lying again. She knew it. The hesitation, the carefully constructed words, the way his eyes briefly darted to the principal's reaction before speaking. It was all too calculated. Principal Harmon frowned. You assumed the permission slips were taken care of. Mr. Grayson, it is your responsibility to ensure all school policies are followed. You don't simply assume these things. Parents must be aware of where their children are at all times. Mr. Grayson nodded, his expression shifting into something more apologetic. I completely understand, and I take full responsibility for the mistake. I should have double-checked, and I assure you, it won't happen again. Julia wasn't buying it. Not one bit. She took a step closer, her voice unwavering. What exactly happened at your house, Mr. Grayson? What did Mia and Emma do while they were there? Mr. Grayson turned to her with a smile. But there was something else lurking beneath it. Something wrong. Oh, nothing out of the ordinary. We had lunch, talked about the museum trip, and I let them watch a short documentary on my TV before we returned to school. A sharp chill ran down Julia's spine. A short documentary. Mia hadn't mentioned that. Why? Before she could press further, Principal Harmon spoke again, her voice carrying an edge of authority. Mr. Grayson, I'm going to need you to provide the exact details of that day, including the time frame, what was discussed, and... She paused, her expression darkening. Who else was in the house? Something about that last question made Mr. Grayson shift uncomfortably, but he quickly masked it. Of course, he said smoothly. I'll provide all the details in writing. No, Julia interjected. She was done playing this game. I want answers now. There was a tense silence in the room. Mr. Grayson's smile faltered just slightly before he spoke again, this time with an attempt at reassurance. Mrs. Carter, I promise you, nothing inappropriate happened. I would never do anything to make a child uncomfortable. I've dedicated my life to teaching and mentoring students. Julia studied him carefully. His words were exactly what someone in his position should say, but they didn't comfort her. Instead, they made her more suspicious. Then you won't mind if I ask Emma myself, she said. since she was there too. A flicker of something flashed across Mr. Grayson's face. Concern, anxiety. It was gone as quickly as it came. Before he could respond, Principal Harmon stood. "Mrs. Carter, if you'd like to speak with Emma and Mia together, I can arrange for that." And Mr. Grayson, she turned toward the teacher, her expression now unreadable. "I will need you to provide a full written statement by the end of the day. Until this matter is resolved, you are not to take students anywhere without explicit written permission." Mr. Grayson nodded, his smile still plastered on his face, but Julia didn't miss the slight clench of his jaw. He was tense, uncomfortable. He didn't like that the situation was escalating. That only made Julia more determined. She left the office with Principal Harmon, her heart racing. They walked down the hallway in silence before Julia finally spoke. "You don't believe him, do you?" Principal Harmon sighed, glancing at her. "I don't know what to believe yet, but I will get to the bottom of it." She paused for a moment. "I know you're worried, and I understand why. But I need to do this the right way. If there's something wrong here, I'll find it." Julia nodded, though her unease didn't ease. She wasn't going to wait around for an internal investigation. She was going to take matters into her own hands. Later that evening, when Julia picked up Mia from school, she immediately noticed her daughter's excitement. Mia chattered on about her day, about how her friend Sophie brought a new stuffed animal to school, about how she got a gold star on her spelling quiz. But Julia's mind was elsewhere. She waited until they got home, until Mia was settled with a snack at the kitchen table, before gently steering the conversation. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, sitting down beside her daughter. "Can I ask you something about Mr. Grayson?" Mia, still chewing on her crackers, looked up at her mother with innocent curiosity. "Sure. You told me you and Emma went to his house after the museum, right?" Mia nodded. "Aha. What did you do there?" Julia asked carefully, watching her daughter's reaction. Mia shrugged, dipping a cracker into her yogurt. "We had lunch, then we watched a video. Then he let us play with his cat." Julia's stomach twisted. "A video? What kind of video?" Mia tilted her head as if trying to remember. "It was about animals. Like how lions hunt in the wild. It was kinda cool, but also kinda scary." Julia exhaled, relieved that it didn't seem inappropriate, at least on the surface. But something still gnawed at her. "Did anything feel weird while you were there?" she pressed. Mia frowned. "Weird how?" "Like, did Mr. Grayson ever ask you to keep it a secret? Or did he say anything strange?" Mia's brows knitted together, and for a moment she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she said, "Well, he said not to tell anyone about his house." Julia's entire body tensed. "What do you mean?" Mia looked uncomfortable now, shifting in her chair. "He said some parents might not like the idea of us visiting a teacher's house, so it was better if we just kept it between us." A cold chill settled over Julia's skin. "He told you not to tell," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded, seeming confused by her mother's reaction. "Yeah, but it wasn't a big deal, right?" Julia forced a smile, though inside, she was screaming. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "It's not your fault at all. But I do need you to tell me if a grown-up ever tells you to keep something a secret, okay? No matter what." Mia nodded solemnly. "Okay, Mommy." Julia kissed the top of her daughter's head, but her mind was already racing. This was not normal. This was not okay. Mr. Grayson had explicitly told the children not to tell their parents about the visit, and that meant one thing. He was hiding something. Julia wasn't going to sit back and wait. She was going to find out exactly what that was, even if it meant tearing his perfect little world apart. A mother's worst fear. Julia barely slept that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with every terrible possibility. Mr. Grayson had told the children not to tell anyone about his house. That one fact alone set off every alarm in her head. What kind of teacher tells kids to keep secrets from their parents? The thought made her stomach churn. She turned onto her side, watching the soft glow of the nightlight in Mia's room spill under the door. Her daughter was sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside her mother. Julia envied her innocence, but she also knew that innocence was fragile. It could be taken away in an instant. By the time morning came, Julia had already made her decision. She was done waiting for answers. She was done playing the patient, reasonable parent. Today, she would get the truth. The confrontation. Julia arrived at Silverwood Academy just before classes started. The hallways were bustling with students, the air filled with chatter and laughter. But Julia wasn't here for small talk. She marched straight to Principal Harmon's office, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. Mrs. Coleman, the school secretary, looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Carter, back again so soon?" "I need to see Principal Harmon," Julia said, her voice tight. Mrs. Coleman hesitated. "She's in a meeting." "I'll wait," Julia cut in, folding her arms. Mrs. Coleman glanced at the closed office door, then sighed and picked up the phone. Moments later, the door swung open, and Principal Harmon stepped out, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Carter," she greeted. "I assume this is about Mr. Grayson." Julia stepped into the office, barely waiting for the principal to close the door behind her. "Yes," she said firmly, "and I want answers. Now." Principal Harmon sighed, gesturing for Julia to take a seat. "I spoke with Mr. Grayson after our conversation yesterday. He insists it was an innocent mistake. He genuinely didn't think he was violating policy by taking the children to his home." Julia clenched her fists. "It doesn't matter what he thought. He took my daughter and another child to his house without telling their parents. That is not a mistake. That is a deliberate decision." The principal exhaled. "I understand your frustration, and I share your concern. That's why I've already taken action. Mr. Grayson has been placed on administrative leave while we investigate further." Julia blinked. "Administrative leave," she repeated. "That's it. You're telling me he gets to sit at home while you investigate." "Mrs. Carter," Principal Harmon said carefully, "we can't jump to conclusions without solid evidence. So far, we have no indication that anything inappropriate happened." Julia leaned forward, her voice sharp. "My daughter told me he told them to keep it a secret. Isn't that evidence enough?" The principal's eyes darkened slightly, but she remained composed. "That is concerning. But we need more than a child's account to take serious action." Julia's blood boiled. "So what, you're waiting for something worse to happen before you actually do something?" Principal Harmon was silent for a moment before speaking again, her voice lower this time. "Off the record, Mrs. Carter, I agree with you. Something doesn't sit right with me either. That's why I've already contacted the school district. They're sending an external investigator to review the situation." Julia's shoulders stiffened. This was more than she had expected. "An investigator?" The principal nodded. "Yes, but in the meantime, I strongly encourage you to talk to Mia. See if she remembers anything else. If you find anything alarming, I need you to tell me immediately." Julia swallowed hard. She had already planned on doing exactly that. She stood. "Fine, but make no mistake, Principal Harmon, I won't stop until I get the full truth." Principal Harmon nodded solemnly. "Neither will I." The discovery. That evening, Julia sat down with Mia again, determined to press for more details. She had to be careful. She didn't want to scare her daughter, but she needed to know exactly what had happened at Mr. Grayson's house. "Mia, sweetheart," she said, setting a plate of cookies in front of her daughter, "I need you to think really hard about something." Mia took a bite of a cookie, looking at her mother curiously. "Okay. When you were at Mr. Grayson's house, you said you watched a video about animals, right?" Mia nodded. "Did you do anything else? Did he ask you any weird questions? Did he ever make you feel uncomfortable?" Mia frowned slightly, her fingers idly picking at the edge of her cookie. "No, But Julia's heart pounded. But what baby? Mia hesitated. He had a camera. Julia froze. A camera. Mia nodded. Yeah, it was on a shelf. He said he uses it for his YouTube videos about history. But he kept moving it while we were there, like he was pointing it at us sometimes. A cold, suffocating feeling gripped Julia's chest. Why would a teacher need a camera pointing at two 10-year-old girls? Did he ever tell you to do anything on camera? She asked, forcing her voice to stay calm. Mia shook her head. No, we just sat on the couch and watched the video. Julia exhaled, but her relief was brief. If he had recorded anything, what was he doing with those recordings? And more importantly, was this the first time? Or had there been others? She had heard enough. Mia, she said, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. I need you to promise me something, okay? Mia nodded. What is it? If any grown-up, anyone at all, ever tells you to keep a secret from me, I want you to tell me immediately, no matter what. Mia looked slightly confused but nodded. Okay, Mommy, I promise. Julia smiled, but inside, she was shaking. As soon as Mia went to bed, Julia grabbed her phone and dialed Rachel's number. Her friend picked up almost instantly. Jules. Rachel's voice was filled with concern. What's wrong? Julia took a deep breath. Mia told me something new. Rachel was silent for a beat before she spoke again. What is it? She said Mr. Grayson had a camera at his house, and he was moving it around while they were there. Rachel sucked in a sharp breath. Oh my God. I don't know if he recorded anything. Maya says she didn't do anything on camera, but Rachel, what if she wasn't the first? Julia's voice trembled. Rachel's voice was firm. You need to go to the police. Julia already knew that. She had suspected something was wrong before, but now she had real reason to believe there was more to this than a simple lapse in judgment. Taking a deep breath, she opened her phone's search bar and typed in the number for the local police department. She had hoped she was wrong. She had hoped this was just paranoia. But now she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Mr. Grayson was hiding something, and Julia was going to make damn sure that whatever it was, he would never have the chance to hurt another child again. The reckoning. Julia's hands were clammy as she gripped her phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had always believed that parental instincts were a real thing, that deep, unshakable feeling in your gut that told you when something was wrong. Now, more than ever, she trusted that feeling. Mia's innocent words about Mr. Grayson's camera haunted her. He had moved it around while the children were in his home. Why? What had he been trying to capture? Julia couldn't shake the image from her mind. What if there were other recordings? What if there were other children? Her finger hovered over the call button. Calling the police would make this real. It would take this situation out of her hands and into theirs. But wasn't that what she wanted? Wasn't that what she needed to do? She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and finally pressed call. The investigation begins. The dispatcher took her report seriously. Within the hour, 2 uniformed officers were at her doorstep. Julia had sent Mia up to bed early, not wanting her daughter to overhear what was about to be discussed. As she led the officers into her living room, she could barely keep her hands from shaking. One of the officers, a tall woman with piercing green eyes, spoke first. Mrs. Carter, we appreciate you calling us. We understand this is a sensitive matter, and we want to be as thorough as possible. Can you walk us through everything from the beginning? Julia took a deep breath. It started when Mia mentioned going to Mr. Grayson's house after a museum trip. I never signed a permission slip. Neither did another parent, Lisa Dawson. That was the first red flag. The officers exchanged glances but remained silent, letting her continue. Then, I found out that Mr. Grayson told the kids to keep the visit a secret. That was when I knew something wasn't right. But tonight, Julia swallowed hard. Tonight, Mia told me there was a camera in his house, and that he moved it around while they were there. The second officer, A burly man with salt and pepper hair frowned. Did she say whether she was recorded? Julia shook her head. She doesn't think so. But that doesn't mean there aren't recordings of other kids. The female officer nodded, her expression grave. This is extremely concerning, Mrs. Carter. What you've described could indicate something more serious than a simple policy violation. We're going to open an investigation immediately. Julia exhaled, barely registering her relief. What does that mean? What happens now? The male officer pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open. First, we'll need to speak with your daughter. I know that's difficult, but we have specialists trained to talk to children about sensitive topics. We also need to gather any related evidence, messages, emails, anything from the school that references this trip. Julia nodded. I have the text from another parent confirming she didn't sign permission for her daughter to go. I also spoke with the principal, and she said she never approved Mr. Grayson taking the kids to his house. The officers wrote down the information, their expressions turning more serious by the second. The female officer spoke again. Next, we'll need to speak with Mr. Grayson himself. If he has a camera, we need to find out what he's been using it for. Julia's stomach churned. And if he's been recording the children. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. Then he will be arrested. Julia inhaled sharply. This was really happening. A shocking revelation. The next morning, Julia barely got through getting Mia ready for school. She had called Lisa Dawson late at night to inform her of the situation, and Lisa had agreed to call the police herself. Julia knew that the more parents who spoke up, the stronger the case against Mr. Grayson would be. As soon as she dropped Mia off, she parked outside Silverwood Academy, waiting. She knew the police would be arriving at the school to question Mr. Grayson, and she wanted to see it happen. The minutes ticked by painfully slow. Then, at exactly 9:30 a.m., 2 police cruisers pulled up to the front of the school. Julia sat up straighter, watching as uniformed officers stepped out. A murmur spread through the few parents who were still lingering outside. A few moments later, Principal Harmon appeared at the school's entrance, her face tight with concern. She led the officers inside, and Julia clenched her fists in her lap, barely able to contain her anticipation. And then it happened. 20 minutes later, Mr. Grayson was led out in handcuffs. The sight sent a wave of relief crashing over Julia. Parents gathered near the entrance, whispering in shock, their eyes darting between the arrested teacher and the officers. Mr. Grayson's face was tight with barely concealed panic. His perfect, carefully crafted persona was crumbling in real time. One of the officers placed a firm hand on Mr. Grayson's shoulder, guiding him toward the waiting police car. Julia couldn't stop watching. She had suspected, but now she knew. She had been right. She had trusted her gut, and she had saved her daughter from something horrible. Suddenly, as if sensing her gaze, Mr. Grayson's eyes snapped to her. For the briefest moment, he just stared at her. And then, he smiled. A slow, unsettling, knowing smile. Julia's blood ran ice cold. The aftermath. The days that followed were a whirlwind of investigation and shocking discoveries. The police obtained a warrant and searched Mr. Grayson's home. What they found sent shivers down Julia's spine. There were recordings, not just of Mia and Emma, but of multiple children who had been in Mr. Grayson's class over the years. Most of the footage seemed innocent. Children doing classwork, kids talking about their favorite books or their home lives. But the fact that it existed at all was disturbing. And then there was the hidden folder. Buried deep inside his computer was a set of files, carefully labeled. Some of them were photos of students, pictures that should have never left the classroom. Some were screenshots from videos. But the most horrifying part, some of the images had been edited. Nothing explicit, but enough to show his twisted obsession. Enough to make it clear that his interest in his students went far beyond teaching. Julia sat in the police station, numb, as the detectives explained everything. "Your daughter is safe," one of them assured her. "We don't believe she was harmed in any way." But Mr. Grayson, he's been doing this for years. Julia clenched her fists. What happens to him now? The detective's expression hardened. With this evidence, he's never going to see the outside of a prison cell again. Relief crashed over her, but it was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. How many other parents had trusted this man? How many other children had sat in his classroom, completely unaware of what he truly was? Julia didn't sleep that night. She sat by Mia's bed, watching her daughter's peaceful face, listening to the steady sound of her breathing. She had done what she had to do. She had trusted her instincts, and she had stopped a predator before he could go any further. But the fear remained, because if she had ignored that one innocent comment, "I went to Daddy's house," Maya could have been just another name on that list, and that thought would haunt her forever. A mother's victory, a lesson never forgotten. The weeks that followed were a blur of police statements, legal proceedings, and difficult conversations. The news about Mr. Grayson spread like wildfire. Parents were horrified. The school district was in chaos, desperately trying to salvage its reputation. Reporters swarmed Silverwood Academy, demanding answers. Julia was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained, but she refused to rest until she was sure that justice would be served. Lisa Dawson, along with a group of other concerned parents, banded together with Julia. They pushed the school to implement stricter background checks and better security measures. The district had no choice but to comply. They couldn't afford another scandal like this. Mr. Grayson, he never stood a chance in court. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The hidden recordings, the photos, the manipulated images, it painted a clear picture of a deeply disturbed man who had spent years abusing the trust of parents and children alike. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. When Julia heard the verdict, she didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She simply exhaled, a weight she didn't realize she had been carrying lifting from her chest. He would never hurt another child again. Healing and moving forward. Mia didn't fully understand what had happened. She only knew that Mr. Grayson wasn't coming back to school and that something bad had been discovered about him. Julia decided not to tell her the details. Someday, when she was older, she would explain. But for now, Mia was safe, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Maya leaned against her mother, her voice soft. "Mommy," she murmured. "Yes, baby. I'm glad you listened to me." Julia blinked, looking down at her daughter's small face, at the trust and love in her wide brown eyes. That one sentence hit her harder than anything else. She wrapped her arms around Mia, holding her close, knowing just how close she had come to missing the warning signs. "I'll always listen to you, sweetheart," Julia whispered. "Always." Mia smiled sleepily, curling up against her mother, safe in the warmth of her embrace. And in that moment, Julia knew she had done the right thing. She had listened. She had fought. And she had won.